Ma'am, I don't think you're in the right cabin. The sentence was delivered politely, but it carried the unmistakable weight of an assumption. Conversations faded throughout the first-class cabin. A businessman paused over his tablet. A young boy removed one earbud. Several passengers looked toward seat 2A, curious to see what had prompted the interruption. Monica Hayes remained seated, one hand resting on the armrest while the other held a weathered leather notebook. She wore a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and black loafers polished from use rather than fashion. There was nothing flashy about her appearance, and that seemed to be exactly what had attracted unwanted attention. Standing a few feet away, Victoria Sterling folded her arms with quiet confidence. Dressed in an immaculate cream jacket and carrying herself with practiced authority, she looked at Monica as though the answer had already been decided. "There has to be some mistake," Victoria said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "First class has standards." A few uncomfortable glances passed between strangers. No one immediately responded. Monica slowly looked up, meeting Victoria's eyes without irritation. "My boarding pass assigned me this seat," she replied evenly. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Victoria offered a thin smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sure the crew can sort that out." She pressed the flight attendant call button. Moments later, senior flight attendant Nicole Bennett arrived with the calm professionalism expected before departure. "Good afternoon," she said. "How may I help?" Victoria gestured toward Monica. "I believe there may be an issue with her seating assignment. Would you mind checking before we close the door?" Nicole turned toward Monica. For a brief moment, her eyes moved from Monica's simple clothing to the seat number beside her. The glance lasted only seconds, but Monica noticed it. She had learned years ago that prejudice often appeared first as hesitation rather than hostility. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Nicole asked. Monica handed it over without objection. Nicole scanned the barcode. The screen confirmed seat 2A. She read it again, then quietly excused herself toward the forward galley, carrying the device with her. Victoria relaxed into her seat with obvious satisfaction. "It's amazing," she murmured, "how confident some people become when they assume no one will verify the facts." Across the aisle, schoolteacher Daniel Ortiz frowned. Beside him, retired nurse Evelyn Parker watched Monica with growing concern. "She hasn't done anything wrong," Evelyn whispered. Daniel nodded but remained silent. Monica sat motionless, her expression unchanged. Years earlier, she had been mistaken for catering staff outside a luxury conference, where she had been scheduled to negotiate the largest acquisition of her career. On another occasion, she had been asked whether she was waiting for an executive she was actually there to lead. Different cities, different faces, the same quiet judgment. Near the front of the cabin, Nicole spoke softly with another crew member before disappearing behind the galley curtain. Outside the aircraft, baggage handlers completed the final loading while the pushback tug waited in position. Everything beyond the windows continued according to schedule. Inside first class, however, a far more important test had already begun, and before the aircraft ever left the gate, everyone on board would discover that the most valuable thing in the cabin had never been the seat itself, but the assumptions people chose to make before knowing the truth. Nicole Bennett disappeared through the curtain into the forward galley, leaving Monica Hayes alone with dozens of curious eyes fixed in her direction. The cabin remained unusually quiet. Even the familiar sounds of overhead bins closing and passengers settling into their seats seemed muted beneath the growing tension. Monica rested both hands lightly on her notebook and looked through the oval window. Beyond the glass, fuel trucks rolled past with practiced precision while baggage crews completed the final containers. Outside, every movement followed a timetable measured to the minute. Inside, time seemed to slow. Victoria Sterling leaned comfortably against her seat, convinced events were unfolding exactly as they should. "It never hurts to verify," she remarked to no one in particular. "Premium cabins exist for a reason." A middle-aged businessman several rows ahead briefly looked over his shoulder but chose not to respond. Daniel Ortiz shifted uneasily in his seat. Evelyn Parker continued watching Monica instead of Victoria. What caught Evelyn's attention was not confidence or fear, but composure. Monica displayed neither irritation nor embarrassment. She simply waited, as though she understood that rushing to defend herself would accomplish nothing. A few moments later, Nicole returned accompanied by lead flight supervisor Allison Reed, whose pressed uniform and measured expression reflected years of experience handling customer concerns. Allison greeted Monica politely before examining the boarding pass herself. The barcode confirmed seat 2A without hesitation. She compared it against the electronic passenger list displayed on her handheld device. Again, everything matched. Yet the complaint hanging over the cabin made the straightforward verification feel unexpectedly complicated. "Ms. Hayes," Allison said carefully, "would you mind joining us in the galley for a brief discussion? I'd like to clarify one or two details before departure." Monica accepted the request without protest. "May I ask what requires clarification?" Allison paused briefly before answering. "I'd simply like to ensure our records are complete." Monica stood, smoothing the sleeve of her charcoal sweater before accepting her boarding pass. The explanation sounded courteous, but experience had taught her that vague explanations often concealed uncomfortable assumptions. Years earlier, security staff at an investment summit had insisted she enter through a service entrance because they believed she worked for the catering company. Another executive later apologized after discovering she had been scheduled to deliver the keynote address. The memory surfaced only briefly before fading again. She refused to let old wounds dictate present decisions. As Monica followed Allison toward the galley, another flight attendant named Emily Carter glanced at the passenger manifest displayed on a nearby tablet. Monica's reservation carried a restricted operational notation unlike anything Emily had encountered during routine service. She leaned closer, reading only enough to realize the reservation required review through corporate operations before any seating changes could be considered. Before she could examine it further, Allison gently lowered the screen. "I'll handle this," she said quietly. Emily nodded, although uncertainty lingered on her face. Back in the cabin, Victoria settled deeper into her seat with visible satisfaction. She believed the matter was nearly resolved. Daniel looked toward Evelyn and whispered, "Something about this doesn't feel right." Evelyn answered softly, "Sometimes people reveal more about themselves by making accusations than the person they accuse." Neither of them realized that the brief conversation taking place just beyond the curtain would soon determine far more than where one passenger happened to be sitting. The forward galley felt noticeably smaller once the curtain settled behind Monica Hayes. Away from the eyes of most passengers, the atmosphere became more formal, yet no less uncomfortable. Allison Reed held Monica's boarding pass in one hand while reviewing the reservation on her company tablet. Every detail matched. Seat 2A. First class. Check-in completed. Boarding verified. There was no discrepancy to explain why Monica had been questioned in the first place. Even so, Allison continued scrolling through the reservation, hoping she had overlooked something that would justify bringing the passenger out of her seat. Nicole Bennett stood beside her with folded arms. "We've had fraudulent upgrades before," she said quietly. "I'd rather confirm everything now than discover a problem after departure." Monica met her eyes without the slightest hint of frustration. "My identification matched my boarding pass," she replied. "The boarding scanner accepted my ticket. May I ask what concern remains?" Allison hesitated. She searched for a careful answer, but found none that sounded convincing. Before she could respond, Emily Carter approached with another tablet in her hands. "Supervisor," she said cautiously, "I noticed a restricted operations notice attached to Ms. Hayes' reservation." Allison looked at the screen. A discreet message appeared beneath the reservation details. "Corporate operations review required before seating adjustment." It was not an instruction commonly seen by cabin crew. Emily lowered her voice. "I've never come across this before." Allison studied the notice for another moment before locking the tablet. "For now, we leave the reservation unchanged," she said. Nicole looked surprised. "So she returns to her seat?" Allison did not answer immediately. She understood that sending Monica back without explanation would almost certainly provoke another confrontation with Victoria Sterling. At the same time, there was no legitimate basis for moving Monica elsewhere. Through the partially opened curtain, Victoria's voice drifted into the galley. "How much longer is this going to take?" she called impatiently. People paid a premium for this cabin. Several passengers shifted uneasily. Daniel Ortiz looked toward the front of the aircraft before quietly speaking to Evelyn Parker. "This stopped being about a seat a long time ago." Evelyn nodded. Now it's about whether anyone is willing to admit they made the wrong assumption. Monica listened without interrupting. She had spent years negotiating contracts where emotions often became louder than facts. Experience had taught her that the first person to lose composure usually surrendered the strongest position. Allison finally looked back at Monica. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate your patience." Monica offered a courteous smile. Patience is easier when the facts are clear. The simple remark lingered in the silence. No accusation, no sarcasm, just a quiet reminder that the evidence had never changed. Emily glanced once more at the locked tablet resting in Allison's hands. Whatever the operations notice meant, it suggested that someone beyond the airport had an interest in ensuring Monica Hayes was treated according to company policy. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge remained attached while ground crews waited for pushback clearance. Inside the galley, Allison realized the next decision could no longer be based on appearances or assumptions. It would have to be based on facts alone, and those facts were beginning to point in a direction none of them had expected. Allison Reed took a slow breath before handing Monica Hayes her boarding pass back. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "At this moment, I have no reason to question your reservation." Monica accepted the boarding pass with a courteous nod but made no move toward the aisle. She noticed the uncertainty in Allison's expression. The supervisor had reached the correct conclusion, yet something was still preventing her from ending the incident. That hesitation told Monica everything she needed to know. Beyond the galley curtain, the atmosphere inside first class had grown increasingly tense. Victoria Sterling checked her watch with visible irritation before raising her voice again. "How much longer is this going to take? We're delaying an entire flight over something that should have been obvious 5 minutes ago." Her words carried through the cabin, drawing another round of uneasy glances from nearby passengers. Daniel Ortiz looked toward the front of the aircraft before quietly saying, "Nobody else seems concerned except her." Evelyn Parker nodded. Sometimes people mistake confidence for being right. Their conversation was barely above a whisper, but Victoria noticed them watching. She straightened in her seat and folded her arms. "You're free to disagree," she called back, "but airlines have standards for a reason." No one answered. The silence that followed was far more uncomfortable than any argument. In the galley, Emily Carter remained focused on the reservation notice she had glimpsed only moments earlier. The wording itself was brief, but unusual enough to stay in her mind. Corporate operations review required before seating adjustment. She had worked only 8 months for the airline, yet every training session had emphasized one principle above all others: never override a restricted operational instruction without approval from the appropriate department. She looked toward Allison again. "Should we contact corporate operations before making any further decision?" she asked carefully. Allison considered the suggestion. It was the safest option. It was also the option most likely to prolong the delay and invite further complaints from Victoria. Nicole Bennett exhaled quietly. "If we make that call," she said, "this aircraft isn't leaving on schedule." Monica listened without interruption. She understood that the discussion had quietly shifted away from her identity. The real question had become whether the crew would trust documented procedure or surrender to pressure from the loudest passenger in the cabin. Allison finally reached for the interphone mounted beside the galley wall. Instead of dialing immediately, she paused and looked at Monica. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "I appreciate the way you've handled this." Monica smiled politely. Professionalism is easiest when everyone follows the same standard. The answer lingered in the small space between them. Emily noticed Allison's shoulders relax slightly, as though the simple remark had reminded her what her responsibility actually was. Without another word, Allison pressed the operations line. After a brief pause, a calm voice answered from the ground coordination desk. Allison identified the flight, explained that a restricted reservation required verification before any seating change could be considered, and waited. The response came almost immediately. "Do not modify that passenger seating assignment," the operations coordinator said. "Executive Operations has already been notified and is reviewing the matter. Please maintain the current reservation until further instructions are received." Allison thanked the coordinator and slowly lowered the handset. Nicole looked at her in surprise. Emily quietly released the breath she had been holding. Monica remained composed, but she recognized the significance of what had just happened. The decision was no longer being made inside the cabin. Somewhere beyond the airport terminal, people with access to the complete picture had begun paying attention, and before long, everyone on Flight 417 would understand why. Allison Reed set the interphone back into its cradle without saying a word. The message from corporate operations had been brief, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Monica Hayes' seating assignment was not to be changed. Executive operations had already assumed responsibility for the matter. For the first time since the confrontation began, Allison realized the decision was no longer hers to make. Nicole Bennett searched Allison's face for reassurance, but found only uncertainty. "What did they say?" she asked quietly. Allison answered just loudly enough for the crew to hear. "We leave Ms. Hayes exactly where she is. We wait for further instructions." Emily Carter lowered her eyes, relieved that procedure had finally replaced assumption. Monica accepted the update with the same calm expression she had worn since boarding. She neither celebrated nor commented. She simply thanked Allison with a polite nod and stepped back toward the first-class cabin. The moment she appeared through the curtain, dozens of eyes followed her. Victoria Sterling immediately stood. "Well," she demanded, "I assume the misunderstanding has been corrected." Monica returned to seat 2A without responding. She placed her notebook on the armrest and fastened her seat belt as though nothing unusual had happened. Victoria looked toward Allison in disbelief. "You're allowing her to stay?" Allison chose her words carefully. "Ms. Hayes is seated in her assigned seat, and at this time there will be no change." Victoria's expression hardened. "That's unacceptable. I expect someone with authority to review this." Allison maintained her professional tone. "That review is already underway." The answer only deepened Victoria's frustration. Around the cabin, the emotional balance had begun to shift. Earlier, most passengers had remained silent, uncertain of the facts. Now they had watched a verified reservation survive repeated scrutiny. Daniel Ortiz quietly closed his tablet. "Looks like the records were right all along," he said. Evelyn Parker smiled faintly. "Sometimes the hardest thing for people to accept is that their first impression was wrong." Victoria ignored them. She removed her phone and began typing rapidly, clearly intending to escalate the complaint herself. Outside the aircraft, the scheduled departure time came and went. The jet bridge remained connected. Baggage crews waited for updated instructions, while the pushback tug stayed motionless beneath the cockpit windows. Inside the flight deck, Captain Jonathan Mercer reviewed a notification that had just appeared in the airline's operations system. The message instructed him to remain at the gate until executive operations completed a priority review concerning a passenger already on board. No explanation accompanied the request, only a confirmation code and a directive not to begin pushback. Jonathan frowned. Such operational holds were extremely uncommon and rarely issued without significant reason. He acknowledged the message, then contacted ground operations for clarification. The response was simple: "Remain at the gate. A representative from executive operations will contact you shortly." Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had changed from confrontation to anticipation. Victoria still believed influence and persistence would eventually produce the outcome she expected. Monica, meanwhile, quietly looked through the cabin window as evening light reflected across the wing. She knew exactly why the aircraft remained at the gate. More importantly, she knew that within minutes the conversation would no longer revolve around appearances, clothing, or assumptions. It would revolve around documented facts, and facts had a remarkable way of changing the people who believed they already knew the truth. Captain Jonathan Mercer read the operations notice a second time before setting his tablet down. During nearly 2 decades in commercial aviation, he had encountered weather diversions, medical emergencies, mechanical inspections, and security alerts. An executive operations hold issued moments before pushback was something else entirely. It was rare, and it was never sent without a reason. He looked toward First Officer Lisa Grant. "Keep the departure checklist on hold," he said calmly. "Operations wants this aircraft to remain at the gate until we receive further instructions." Lisa nodded, equally puzzled. "Any indication why?" Jonathan shook his head. "Only that it concerns a verified passenger already on board." In the first-class cabin, impatience continued to spread. Victoria Sterling checked the time once more before pressing the flight attendant call button again. Nicole Bennett answered, though the confidence she had displayed earlier had noticeably faded. "Yes, Miss Sterling?" Victoria leaned forward. "We've missed our departure slot because no one is willing to make a simple decision. I'd like to speak with the captain." Nicole chose her words carefully. "The captain is currently coordinating with operations." "Then tell him one passenger is delaying an entire aircraft," Victoria replied sharply. Several nearby travelers exchanged weary glances. Daniel Ortiz quietly looked toward Monica Hayes, who remained focused on the airport lights beyond the window rather than the growing frustration around her. Evelyn Parker smiled faintly. "Interesting," she whispered to Daniel. "The calmest person on this airplane is the one everyone accused." Monica heard the comment, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that patience often accomplished more than confrontation. Every unnecessary argument only distracted from the facts, and she knew the facts were already moving through channels far beyond the cabin. A soft chime sounded over Nicole's company device. She glanced down and saw a brief instruction requesting that Allison Reed contact the captain immediately. Nicole handed the message to Allison without comment. Allison walked briskly toward the cockpit, knocked once, and stepped inside after receiving permission. Jonathan greeted her with a professional nod. "I'm assuming this concerns our operational hold." Allison briefly summarized everything that had happened since boarding began. The complaint, the repeated verification of Monica Hayes' reservation, the restricted operations notice, and corporate operations instruction not to alter the seating assignment. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Was Ms. Hayes' identity ever found to be inconsistent with her boarding credentials?" "No," Allison answered. "Everything verified correctly." Jonathan remained silent for several seconds. "Then this was never a ticket issue." Allison lowered her eyes. "No, Captain." Before either could continue, Jonathan's secure communications panel illuminated again. An incoming call from Executive Operations appeared on the display. He accepted it immediately. "Captain Mercer speaking." A composed voice answered. "Captain, thank you for holding the aircraft. Executive Operations appreciates your cooperation. We will brief you now. The passenger seated in 2A is Monica Hayes. Her reservation is fully authorized. More importantly, she is traveling as part of an executive service assessment requested by our parent company's board of directors. The review concerns customer treatment and operational decision-making. Please proceed carefully. A senior executive representative is joining the call now." Jonathan listened without speaking. The explanation instantly transformed what had seemed like an ordinary passenger complaint into something far more significant. He thanked the caller, ended the conversation, and looked toward Allison. "I believe," he said quietly, "everyone on this aircraft is about to understand why assumptions can become extraordinarily expensive." Allison felt her stomach tighten. Outside the cockpit windows, twilight settled across the airport. Inside Flight 417, the final pieces of the truth were beginning to fall into place. Captain Jonathan Mercer remained silent for several moments after ending the secure call. The cockpit suddenly felt much smaller. What had begun as a passenger dispute had become an executive-level review of how airline employees responded when confronted with bias disguised as customer service. He stood, straightened his uniform jacket, and turned to First Officer Lisa Grant. "Remain here and continue coordinating with ground operations," he said. "I'll handle this personally." Lisa nodded without hesitation. Moments later, the reinforced cockpit door opened. Conversations throughout first class faded almost instantly as Captain Mercer stepped into the aisle. He acknowledged no one at first, walking directly toward Allison Reed, who waited near the galley with visible concern. "Is Ms. Monica Hayes here?" he asked. Allison stepped aside. "Yes, Captain." Monica rose calmly from seat 2A before he reached her. She offered a courteous smile, neither triumphant nor defensive. Jonathan extended his hand. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for your patience. I owe you an apology on behalf of this flight and our company. Your reservation was verified from the beginning, and you should never have been placed in this position." The cabin fell completely silent. Victoria Sterling stared at the captain, convinced she had misunderstood what she had just heard. "Captain," she interrupted, "surely you're not suggesting this entire delay happened because the crew refused to move one passenger?" Jonathan turned toward her with measured professionalism. "No, Miss Sterling. The delay occurred because concerns were raised about how a confirmed passenger was treated after her credentials had already been validated. Victoria frowned. Then who exactly is Ms. Hayes? Monica answered before the captain could speak. Her voice remained soft, yet every word carried effortlessly through the quiet cabin. My name is Monica Hayes. I serve as Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Meridian Group, one of the airline's largest institutional investors, and I sit on the board of directors of the company's parent organization. No one moved. Daniel Ortiz slowly lowered the tablet resting on his lap. Evelyn Parker drew a quiet breath. Emily Carter looked toward the floor, relieved that the truth no longer depended on her observations alone. Nicole Bennett stood frozen beside Allison, realizing the significance of every decision made since boarding. Victoria searched Monica's face as though expecting some sign that the statement had been exaggerated. Instead, she found only calm confidence. Monica continued, "None of that should have mattered before my boarding pass was verified. The issue was never my title. The issue was how quickly assumptions replaced procedure." Captain Mercer nodded. Executive Operations confirmed that Ms. Hayes is participating in an authorized service assessment requested by the board. Today's review concerns how our employees apply company standards under pressure. Allison closed her eyes briefly. She understood immediately what that meant. Every conversation, every decision, every hesitation had become part of an official record. Victoria's confidence finally disappeared. I didn't know," she said quietly. Monica looked at her without hostility. "No, you didn't. But respect should never depend on knowing someone's resume." Those words settled over the cabin more heavily than any announcement. For the first time since boarding began, nobody seemed interested in seat assignments, social status, or expensive tickets. The discussion had become something much larger. It was about judgment, responsibility, and the quiet consequences of believing appearances were evidence. Outside the aircraft, the evening lights reflected across the terminal windows while ground operations continued waiting for the captain's final instruction. Inside Flight 417, the truth had finally replaced assumption, and every person on board understood that the remainder of the journey would be remembered for reasons no itinerary could have predicted. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sound inside first class was the steady murmur of the aircraft's environmental system. Victoria Sterling slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her confident posture replaced by visible uncertainty. She searched for something to say that might restore control of the situation, but every explanation she considered sounded weaker than the last. Captain Jonathan Mercer remained composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, addressing the cabin, "thank you for your patience. Executive Operations has instructed us to complete a formal review before departure. We appreciate your cooperation." No one complained. The mood inside the cabin had changed completely. Daniel Ortiz looked across the aisle toward Monica Hayes and offered a respectful nod. Evelyn Parker smiled warmly. "I'm glad you stayed exactly where you belonged," she said quietly. Monica returned the smile. "Thank you." Her voice carried no trace of triumph. Emily Carter stood beside Allison Reed, waiting for instructions. Allison finally turned to her. "Emily, thank you for speaking up when you believed something wasn't right." Emily hesitated before answering. "I wasn't certain what the notice meant. I only knew we shouldn't ignore it." Captain Mercer nodded. Good judgment often begins with respecting procedure rather than assumptions. He then addressed Allison and Nicole privately, but within Monica's hearing. Executive Operations will conduct a full review after today's flight. Until then, I expect every remaining decision to follow company policy precisely. Both women acknowledged the instruction without argument. Allison's expression reflected sincere regret. Nicole's reflected the difficult realization that confidence without fairness could damage far more than a passenger's experience. Victoria finally stood again, though this time her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Ms. Hayes," she began carefully, "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Monica met her eyes calmly. "You judged me after my boarding pass had already proven I belonged here. That's the part worth remembering." Victoria lowered her gaze. She gave a small nod, but did not attempt to defend herself further. The lesson had become impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, a customer service manager boarded the aircraft carrying updated documentation requested by Executive Operations. After speaking briefly with Captain Mercer, the manager approached Victoria. Ms. Sterling, he said professionally, ground operations has arranged an alternative itinerary for you while today's incident is formally documented. Our team will assist you once you leave the aircraft. Victoria looked toward the captain, then toward Monica, before quietly collecting her handbag. She understood that arguing would accomplish nothing. As she walked toward the aircraft door, no one applauded and no one celebrated. The cabin remained respectfully silent. Once she had departed, the customer service manager thanked the remaining passengers for their patience and stepped back onto the jet bridge. Captain Mercer waited until the door closed before turning toward the cabin one final time. Thank you, everyone. We will begin departure preparations shortly. Outside, the jet bridge slowly pulled away from the aircraft while ground crews resumed their positions. Through the window, Monica watched the last rays of daylight settle across the runway. The delay had never been about a seat assignment. It had become an opportunity for an entire team to confront the difference between following a complaint and following the standards they had promised every passenger. That realization would remain long after Flight 417 finally left the gate. The cabin door closed with a soft thud, sealing away the tension that had delayed Flight 417 for nearly an hour. This time, the silence felt lighter. It was no longer filled with suspicion or uncertainty. Instead, it carried the quiet relief that follows when the truth has finally been acknowledged. Captain Jonathan Mercer picked up the interphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "thank you for your patience and professionalism. We have received clearance from ground operations and will begin our departure shortly." Around the cabin, passengers settled back into their seats. Seat belts clicked into place. Overhead bins were checked one final time. Outside the window, the pushback tug eased into position beneath the nose of the aircraft, while the last traces of daylight reflected across the polished fuselage. Monica Hayes watched the activity without saying a word. To anyone observing her, she looked exactly as she had when she first boarded, calm, composed, and entirely unshaken. Emily Carter approached cautiously before returning to her jump seat. "Ms. Hayes," she said softly, "I know an apology can't undo what happened, but thank you for showing more patience than most people would have." Monica smiled warmly. "The important thing isn't what happened to me today. It's what happens the next time someone walks onto an airplane and is judged before they're welcomed." Emily nodded, quietly carrying those words with her. Allison Reed stepped forward next. "I've spent years telling new employees that professionalism means treating every passenger with respect," she admitted. "Today reminded me that those words only matter when we practice them under pressure." Monica offered a small nod of understanding. "Leadership isn't measured when everything goes according to plan," she replied. "It's measured in the moments when doing the right thing becomes uncomfortable." Captain Mercer overheard the exchange as he walked back toward the cockpit. "I couldn't agree more," he said. "Every procedure we follow exists for one reason: to protect people equally. The moment assumptions replace procedure, everyone loses." Daniel Ortiz smiled from across the aisle. "I think everyone on this flight learned something worth remembering." Evelyn Parker closed her newspaper and added, "Respect is easiest to talk about. It's much harder to practice when appearances tempt us to make quick decisions." Several nearby passengers quietly nodded in agreement. No applause broke out. No dramatic celebration followed. The atmosphere felt genuine precisely because it remained understated. A few minutes later, the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. As the engines came to life, Monica looked through the window at the terminal growing smaller behind them. She reflected on the countless meetings, negotiations, and milestones that had shaped her career. None of those achievements had protected her from being underestimated. Yet they had taught her something even more valuable. Dignity never depends on another person's opinion. As Flight 417 turned toward the runway, the events before departure already belonged to the past, but their lesson would remain with everyone on board. Wealth could influence expectations. Titles could open doors. Authority could correct mistakes. But genuine character revealed itself long before any of those things became visible. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needs to prove it. And sometimes the most important journey begins before the aircraft ever leaves the ground.